Hello and welcome to our introduction to RackForms. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the overall interface and workflow in RackForms, and basically how to get you up to speed with building your first forms and collecting data. So I'm here at the RackForms login screen. RackForms is a multi-user application, which means that you can, of course, have multiple people who log into RackForms at various access levels. When you actually install RackForms, you are going to be the administrator of that system, so you have all access and permissions to all the features. But it is important to note that you can create additional user levels at a later time, and those folks would then log in at the same place that you log in, only they'll have the permissions that you assign them with. We're not really going to talk more about user permissions at this point, but just note that as the person who installed RackForms, you will have everything. You can create later users later on. So we log into RackForms, the actual editor itself, then we're going to load whatever job we're working on last. In my particular case, I was working on a job for a cybersecurity site, and so I'm going to bring up the content of that page. But when you first install RackForms, you usually come up with a default or sample job. But just note that as you work, it will keep track of what you're working on last, and it'll always try to open up that previous job first to save you a little bit of time. Generally speaking, then, the interface of RackForms is divided into, I would say, 4 main sections. So at the top of the RackForms editor, you're going to have all your various links and controls. So on the very top bar here, we have the links for the major components of RackForms. So the things like the entry viewer, which we'll take a look at today, survey and report viewer. We can manage users. We can assign ownership to various jobs. And then there's a couple other items in here for managing essentially repeated or sort of global content within RackForms, things like creating global templates for jobs, configuration files, and then also, and critically, we have our link for our documentation, and then an info link which actually shows you the information for your PHP installation. So the top links then have places that you might want to go within RackForms. The second bar that we have here are going to be controls for managing your jobs. So you'll notice starting on the left here that we can load an existing saved job. We can load a job file. So in RackForms, you could save a job out, same as you'd save maybe a Microsoft Word file out to your hard drive, and then you can load it back in at a later time. And then finally, we have our load example job menu. And this menu is a collection of, at this point, 356 jobs that you can load up at any point that will show you a feature of RackForms. And so you can type to filter in this list, and you'll bring up various items. But the idea here, of course, is that if you have something that you're trying to do in RackForms and you don't know how to do it, you can actually just load up one of these jobs at any point, and the job will then show you not only how that feature works, but sometimes include a video that shows you how it works as well. So this is a great resource as you're building jobs to get a quick understanding of how a feature works. And then finally, we have a very important set of buttons on the right-hand side here, which is this is where we create a new job. We can save a job file. This is what then loads into the load a saved job file system. We can export a job, which is not often used, but it's a way for us to essentially package that job up so we can move it to a different server. And then finally, of course, we can delete a job that we've created. There's another system here called Form Wizard. It's one of my favorite features. This has some really interesting automation tools. We're not really going to get into this today, but it is important to note that if you're doing things like importing PDFs or building a form based on essentially an existing template, this is where you'd go for that information. But again, we won't talk too much about it right now, because what I'd really like to focus on this video is the main interface for building forms, which is now this bottom side of the page. So the RackForms editor itself is divided into 3 sort of main panes here. The first pane on the left-hand side is our toolbox. This is where we're going to add pages, and then after we've added pages, we're going to add elements to those pages. You're going to notice then that when I click on any of these buttons, we're going to add that content to the form preview area. And then finally, when I have an element in the form preview section, if I click on it, I'm going to see its attributes brought up in the edit form attributes area. So in RackForms then, generally speaking, we have 3 page types. We have form pages, submission pages, and builder pages. Now you may have seen these if you looked at some of our previous videos as we were looking at RackForms. The basic idea is because RackForms is a form building tool, most of the time what we're going to be building is a form. And so the standard page type is the form page. A form page, one or more form pages, will then eventually write to a submission page. So if a form page is where we collect information from a user, the submission page is where we're actually going to then send that information somewhere. Could be in the form of an email, maybe saving to the entry viewer, again, which we'll look at today, or maybe I'm saving to a custom database, which we'll also look at. Finally, then we have another page type called builder. And builder page is where we pull information from a database and display it to our users. We're not really going to get into this today, but just know that this is a really powerful feature that allows us to build some interesting application scenarios within RackForms. But for now, let's actually start simple. Let's just go ahead and build a very simple contact form. So I'm going to click the form button right here, and it's going to add a new what we call sortable page to my form. So basically in RackForms, when we have a page, it's going to take on one of two layout modes. The default and standard page layout mode, if I click on my header bar right here to show my page attributes, is what we call sortable list. And sortable list simply means that when I add items to my form, they're going to add one on top of another, and it's a list which I can then drag to rearrange if I needed to. However, we also have what's called Freeform Mode, and in Freeform Mode, we can simply drag and drop elements anywhere we want on the page. Now, it is important to note here that while we're really proud that we have our two sort of main layout modes here, generally speaking, we're always going to want to stick with the default, which is sortable list. And the reason why is most of the forms that we create in this modern era are going to need to be responsive. And responsive forms are much easier to create when everything's a list. Because if we use freeform mode, it's a little bit harder to kind of compress things down from, let's say, a desktop to a mobile phone size. However, that doesn't mean that we can't have groups of elements that are placed in random positions, and we'll take a look at that in a few moments with what we call our bucket item. But for now, our basic page has been added. Let's go ahead and add a few elements to our page. So I'm going to add two text fields by clicking on text field, and then I'm going to add a text area, and finally a submit button. At this point, the basic form has been created, so to actually save this data somewhere, I'm going to add again a submission page. And to my submission page, you'll notice the options have changed here. I'm going to add an entry viewer item. Now at this point, we are going to need to name our job. So I'm going to call this demo video job, and I'm going to click save then. And at this point, I've completely built and finished my form. I've added fields to a form, and I've added a way to save that information. And if I actually click save right now, you're going to notice that I'm going to get a preview window that pops up that actually shows me the contents of my form. And in almost all cases, the contents of the final form should exactly match what's on our preview screen right here. Now, what's important about this real quick is that if you've never used RackForms before in your system, you will almost certainly get this pop-up right here blocked. So you want to make sure that you allow pop-ups for RackForms so it doesn't block the preview window that's showing right here. Now at this point, of course, we could certainly deliver this form to users. We'll talk about delivery very shortly at the end of this video, but of course it wouldn't be very helpful to see a form like this because none of the information is specific. We have all the default labels in here, which would make this form pretty hard to fill out. So what we actually want to do is we want to start using this edit form attributes area now to start modifying the contents of my form items. So we took a look at this in one instance by clicking what we call the page header to show that page layout sortable in freeform option. So this meant I selected the page, and then these are the form attributes for the page that I have selected. So what I want to do if I want to modify an individual item is to simply click on it. The interface and the edit form attributes will update, and I can now add new values as I see fit. So for example, I can change the text of this text block right here to be contact form. You'll notice here, of course, that because I've selected essentially a text display item, all the attributes that are showing for me right here deal with a text display item. So it's mainly things like field style. I can change the text color, the width of the element, background colors, gradients, etc. However, if I select another item in my form, you're going to notice that this options area is going to change to reflect that I now have a text field, in this case, selected. And of course, the common attributes area is going to retain some of the same items. In this case, label is a common shared attribute between a piece of text and a form field, but then all the other items down here have actually changed now. So we'll get some of the same field style properties, but now you'll notice that, as you would expect, I can control the validation of an input field. I can control what a tooltip might be. We can have things like conditional processing. I can turn this into a color picker. Maybe I want this to be powered by a database item, or maybe turn into an auto-suggest field. Lots and lots of options here, but in most cases, really all I care about is the thing in the common attribute, which in this case is the label. So that's exactly what I'll do. I'll just change the label from text to name. I can basically go through to the second field, change that to email, and then finally, let's say this is a contact message. At every point, I'm going to quickly point out as I'm doing this, you'll notice that along with the label is a field called field name down here. You'll notice that field name is sort of like a version of the label they just typed in. So here you can say this is contact message, this is email, and this is name. Now the field name property is not something we're going to get too deep into in this video, but it is a really important property to note that when you name something in RackForms, that becomes almost like an identifier that you can use in other contexts. So for example, this field, which is called name right here, I can actually use that to modify my thank you message. So I could say thank you for your submission, put a comma, and then I can use the dynamic variable picker to say go ahead and put the name next. So this becomes what we call a token, and the token is simply F for form field and then name. So this field has the field name of name, and so therefore the F token, the form field token, will take the value of the name field and display it to my users at runtime. And again, we're not going to get too deep into this now, but these tokens are a really important part of the RackForms experience. It's how we can make our forms smart by essentially taking the input a user's provided and use it in interesting ways. In this case, I'm displaying a value to my users, but I could also add, for example, an email item. And in the email item, the to property, so where I'm sending the email to, would become the F token so that the user who filled out the form would get a copy of the email for the form submission. We'll talk more about this in the second video in the series, the more advanced one, but just know that this is one of the keys to the RackForms potential in our system. At any rate, now if I save and preview my form, it looks a lot more specific to what a contact form might be. I have my name, my email, and my contact message. And at this point, I should be able to type in some values here. And if I press submit right here, we're going to go to our submission page. Notice it used that dynamic token right here to actually display that value that I typed in the name field. And if I look at my entry viewer item, you'll see here that the entry viewer item has no properties really to set because it's automatically written my entry to the entry viewer. So if I actually open the entry viewer right here, you'll notice then that I can select my job from the list of jobs in the system, and it'll bring up the entry that I just submitted right here. So this is the, one might say, the simplest possible way to getting information into RackForms. We use the entry viewer to essentially say, take whatever the user has filled out and just put into an automatic table like this right here. Now this is a fairly powerful system. We can sort results by date. We can edit results that are already in the system by typing in new values, and we can export them as tab or XML. We can also print and remove individual entries as well. So this is a really handy way of collecting information quickly. I'll also quickly note that this entry has also been made available to the survey viewer, and I can once again bring this up and I could look at my information in a slightly different way. Now what's important about this though is that this job wasn't really appropriate for a survey because it was kind of asking about contact information and a quick message. So we wouldn't really be able to tally this well, but this is indeed how we'd actually create a form where maybe we ask the same questions with known answers over and over again, and you could very quickly, without doing any extra work, see what the results of that survey were. So last thing we'll take a look at in our introduction video then is just a real quick example of how we might handle something like sending an email. So as we've already seen, we've taken our form here and we've added a couple individual fields. I've added a contact message and I'm sending it to the entry viewer. But what if I wanted to send this as an email? So if I select my form pages here, you'll notice that the options in the toolbox change. So if I have a form page selected, I'm showing elements that deal with essentially form input. But if I select a submission page, I have elements that are related to a form submission. The one I added before was entry viewer, but you'll notice I can also choose between email and email plus. Now we'll talk about email and email plus and their differences in another video, but for now, just know that same as the entry viewer is the sort of one-stop zero configuration way of taking a form entry and putting it into the, in this case, entry viewer. The email item is our one-stop shop way of essentially sending an email very quickly to a user. So for example, I could just say this is going to go to info@rackforms.com. The from address, maybe I'll copy and paste. So it just comes from info again. And then finally subject, I could have maybe sample submission. Then at this point, I could simply run my form again. And when I press the submit button, not only, and this is a really important detail of RackForms, not only is it actually going to save that entry to the entry viewer, it's also going to send an email that entry. So one thing I always like to say is that when it comes to actually sending your data somewhere, it's really natural for us to understand like this concept that when I'm building a form, I can add multiple text fields, say, to my form. And it makes sense because we might want multiple text fields. But same as we can add multiple text fields or input fields, we can also add multiple submission items. So I could send an email and I could save it to the entry viewer, or I could also maybe call a web service, send the result to FTP, and save it to the database. Right? We can add all these to our form at once and they would all act at the same time. We wouldn't have to worry about setting up another configuration for a different form submission technique. You just simply add it to your confirmation page. Finally, the last thing we'll talk about, assuming that this is maybe, let's say, the completed form that we wanted to build, is how we actually embed this. So the basic idea in RackForms is when I have a form, the easiest way to allow users to see that form is to simply have RackForms installed on a publicly accessible web server to essentially save the form out and then to take the link that the user has gotten and then copy and paste that into some location. So maybe you'd copy and paste this as a link on your existing web page, maybe it'd be embedded in an email that you send out, but they will go directly to the job as you see it right here. However, in many cases, we'd want to actually embed this form somewhere. To embed a form is really simple. You simply click the embed button and you copy and paste this link right here for the full URL to the form that you want to embed. What's simple about this, though, is that there's no additional configuration to this. In other words, you just literally copy and paste this to another website and the form will just work. However, an increasingly popular trend is to create forms that are actually standalone. And this used to be a lot easier part of this video to talk about. But unfortunately, in recent versions of all the popular web browsers, there's been a new security measure introduced called same-site cookies. And essentially, when you have a form like we have right here, or basically anything that captures information and has multiple pages to it, at some point you need to change pages. And that act of changing pages means that you need cookies on your web browser to understand where you would just come from and where you're going to. The cookies essentially save the information from one page to the next. Unfortunately, same-site cookie restrictions in browsers are making this much harder to work when you have an embedded form. In other words, if I embedded this form on a different domain than what this is, the same-site cookie restrictions are going to prevent the form from saving information from the time you fill out the form to the time you submit it, which means that your form submission won't work anymore. So this is becoming more and more prevalent as more browsers implement this change. And by change, I mean as of mid-2020, this is now pretty much standard across all browsers. And while they did it for security's sake, it's also made working with forms a little bit more difficult. So here, one of our new features in the newest versions of RackForms, and something that's made directly to work with this restriction, is that we can now take our form and we can apply what we call a responsive template manager style to it. And essentially what this means is you can build a template that has the same header and footer as your main website where you'd want the form to normally be embedded on. You can basically take the header and footer and you can create a new template out of that and apply it to your form. So in other words, if I look at what my form looks like right now, you could see it's literally just a copy of the form preview area. However, if I apply one of my full page template styles to it, and we ship RackForms with a couple different basic ones, for example, basic branded, when I run my form now, it's going to actually include a header and a footer, which we can customize in the template manager right here to actually have all the same styles and functionality that your current login form has, your current form page has. And so this way, the idea, of course, is that you would actually be able to build a form that has the exact same look and feel as your parent website, that even though it's on a different domain, your users wouldn't actually know that at all. So in other words, the experience is the same, but you would simply build a form that removes that restriction for the same site cookies. Now again, it's a little bit of a shame that we have to go into that. This new feature for same site cookies is, again, quite literally within the last 6 months. And we didn't used to have to deal with this in the form world. But unfortunately, with browser security being what it is, we just have to deal with this now. But the good news, of course, is in RackForms, we have an easy way of dealing with that. So that then is the basic introduction to RackForms. We talked a little bit about logging into RackForms, and then we built our first form out by essentially adding a form page, adding a submission page to that form, and then adding fields both to my form and my submission page. In future videos, we're actually going to be talking a little bit more about some of the power features that we have to create all sorts of interesting interactions within RackForms. But for now, we'd actually suggest, as we always do, that if you're just getting started with RackForms, that you actually spend some time to build essentially this skeleton form that we have right here out, get used to the interface and working with the toolbox, the preview, and the edit attributes area, and then just try to change a few things. Maybe change the text color, change label positions, experiment with the validation, maybe making the field required or not. Get used to the interface, and then check out the second video for the next steps to take.